Rain slicks Ashford's tramlines as a corpse waits in a locked study. No wounds, no weapon, only whispers of poison and a ledger of secrets too dangerous to surface. Ashford's tramlines hum beneath iron skies, and in a room above them, a secret waits to tear the city open. I'm Rob, your host, and this is Audible Archives. Like, comment, and subscribe, because the shadows are just getting started.
The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days, and Ashford's tramlines gleamed like wet silver under the gas lamps. From the window of his flat above the old tea shop, Drake Vane watched the last tram grind past, its whistle fading into the low hum of the furnace quarter. He was half a cup into a pot of lapsang when the knock came. It wasn't the police. Knocked 2 sharp raps, pause, then a third. This one was deliberate, slow. A knock that said, "We need to talk, but I'm in no rush." He opened the door to find Inspector Harwood standing there, rain on his coat and a folder under his arm. Harwood was older, all bulk and gristle, with the look of a man who'd spent 30 years kicking down doors. "Evening, Vane. You're 3 hours early for bad news," Drake said, stepping aside. Harwood came in, set the folder on the small table by the stove. The edges were warped, the paper inside already curling from damp. "We've got a death in Ashford's West Bank," Harwood said. "Man named Henry Lestock. Found in his study, locked from the inside. Coroner says he'd been dead about 4 hours before they broke the door." Drake poured another cup of tea and let Harwood keep talking. "Cause of deaths. Tricky. No wound, no struggle. Just a faint discoloration around the lips and fingertips. Could be poison, but there's no cup, no glass, no food. Doctor says it doesn't fit the common stuff." "Family?" Drake asked. "Only a niece, Clara Lestock, 28. She's the one who found him. She swears she had no reason to want him dead. Problem is, the man's will leaves her the whole estate." Drake took a slow sip. "That's the motive, then. What about the opportunity?" Harwood tapped the folder. "That's where it gets tangled. Lestock's neighbors saw Clara arrive after sunset. She says she was coming over for supper. The housekeeper says she was already in the study when Clara got there. Says she saw her through the window, sitting with him. And when the door was forced, Lestock was alone, dead." The rain hammered against the glass. Drake set his cup down. "You've got 2 witnesses putting her both before and after the death. Sounds like you're asking me to find which version is lying." Harwood smiled grimly. "No. I'm asking you to tell me whether motive beats opportunity or the other way around." The Lestock house stood on a narrow street in West Bank where the rain pooled in the gutters and gaslight turned the puddles gold. The building was a narrow 3-story affair, its brickwork dark with age, the kind of place that looked like it remembered better centuries. Drake stepped inside and let the door close behind him. The air was warm but carried a faint metallic tang under the scent of beeswax polish. A woman was waiting in the hallway, dark hair pinned neatly back, coat still damp from the rain. Clara Lestock. She was pale, but her eyes were steady, and when she shook his hand her grip was firm. "You're the detective Harwood sent?" she asked. "That's one way to put it," Drake said. The housekeeper, a wiry woman named Mrs. Fenn, hovered in the background, hands folded in her apron. "It's this way, sir," she said, leading him toward the study. They stopped before a heavy oak door with a brass handle. A jagged splinter marked where the lock had been forced. Drake stepped in. The room smelled faintly sweet, with an undercurrent of dust and paper. The desk was scattered with correspondence, a half-finished letter still in the typewriter. Henry Lestock sat slumped in his chair, head tilted back, eyes closed. His skin had that peculiar waxy stillness Drake had seen before, not from sleep, but from death. Drake circled the room. Windows locked. Hearth cold. Carpet undisturbed. He crouched beside the desk, scanning the floorboards. No cup. No glass. No obvious source for poison if that's what it was. Who found him? Drake asked without looking up. I did, Clara said from the doorway. I came in, saw him like this, and called for Mrs. Fenn. She tried the door, then ran to get help. The neighbors had to force it open. Drake stood. And Mrs. Fenn says she saw you here earlier sitting with him. Clara's brow furrowed. That's impossible. I was at my flat across town until I came here for supper. Mrs. Fenn sniffed. I know what I saw. It was just after 5. I was coming back from the butcher's. The curtains were open. You were in the study, talking to him. Plain as day. Drake watched Clara. No flinch, no quick denial, just a quiet shake of her head. The rain ticked against the glass. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock began to chime the hour. Drake glanced once more at Lestock's still form, then at the lock's splintered wood. Motives obvious, he said quietly. Now we find out who had the real opportunity. Drake stayed in the study after Mrs. Fenn led Clara away. The door now ajar but the room still feeling sealed in its own stale air. He pulled on gloves and began sorting through the papers on the desk. Most were routine bills, property documents, correspondence from solicitors. Then he found it. A single sheet, typed and signed. No date, no address, just a few lines. If you will not keep our arrangement, then there is no more need for secrecy. I will have no choice but to speak to her, and to the police. The type was faint, as if from a worn ribbon, and the language was stripped bare of pleasantries. Drake slipped it into his coat. A threat, maybe. But the her nagged at him. Clara. Someone else? He moved to the typewriter. The half-finished letter still sat in the carriage. And so, my dear, I will expect you at 7. It will be best if we talk before anyone else arrives. HL. 7. Clara claimed she arrived after sunset, but sunset in Ashford this time of year was just past 6:30. If Lestock had been expecting someone else before then, they hadn't left by the time he died. The sweet smell in the room still clung at the back of Drake's throat. Not almonds too faint. He checked the hearth, then the wastepaper basket. Nothing burned recently. In the corner, behind the armchair, something caught the light. A scrap of colored paper torn from what looked like the label of a medicinal bottle. He couldn't make out the whole name, just Tyne. Mrs. Fenn's voice floated in from the hall. Detective, will you be needing anything else? Not yet, Drake said, tucking the scrap into the same pocket as the letter. But I'll want a word with you before I go. When she nodded, he caught a flash of something in her expression, irritation, maybe, or fear. Hard to tell in the dim light. The front door latch clicked open downstairs. A man's voice, sharp and impatient. I told you I'd handle it, Clara. Why bring in? He stopped when he saw Drake on the stairs. Tall, sharp-featured, in a gray three-piece suit. His eyes flicked from Drake to the study, then back. And you are? The man asked. Drake Vane, Drake said. And you? The man's smile was thin. Adrian Price. Mr. Lestock's solicitor. Or, I was. Adrian Price moved like a man who had long ago learned to walk into a room and own it, even a room with a corpse in the next doorway. He removed his gloves with measured care, slipping them into his breast pocket before speaking again. You'll forgive me, Price said, but I wasn't expecting the police to involve outside help. I'm not police, Drake said. Just a man who asks questions when they start piling up faster than answers. Price's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Ah, a free agent. Dangerous breed. Drake motioned toward the study. You were Mr. Lestock's solicitor. That means you know his will. Price adjusted his cufflinks. I do. Miss Clara is his sole heir, the estate, the house, the investments. She'll be comfortable. Comfortable enough to wait for his natural death? Drake asked. The solicitor's gaze sharpened. If you're implying... I'm not implying, Drake cut in. I'm measuring. Motives easy. Opportunity less so. You know who else was expected here tonight. Price's pause was almost imperceptible, but Drake caught it. Expected. 7 o'clock meeting, Drake said. Lestock's words. Typed and signed. Someone was meant to arrive before Clara. Did they? Price's expression cooled. If such a meeting existed, I wasn't informed. Then maybe you were the meeting, Drake said. The solicitor laughed softly, but there was no mirth in it. Detective, if I'd wanted Henry dead, I'd have found a less theatrical way than locking the door from inside and vanishing. Mrs. Fenn appeared at the foot of the stairs, her voice tight. Mr. Price, if you're here to see Miss Clara, she's in the drawing room. Price brushed past Drake, pausing only to say, do let me know when you find the real suspect. I'm curious. Drake watched him go, then turned back to Mrs. Fenn. You don't like him, Drake said. I don't like lawyers, she replied flatly. Down the hallway, a door shut softly. Drake heard the low murmur of Price's voice mingling with Clara's, too quiet to make out. He glanced once more at the study door still ajar, the faint sweet smell curling out into the hall. If Lestock had died without a trace of struggle, someone had either used something he trusted, or something he never saw coming. Millwright Street was still slick from the morning rain when Drake stepped off the tram. The air smelled of oil and iron from the nearby foundry, each clanging hammer blow echoing along the narrow lanes. A faded sign swinging in the damp breeze read, Baker and Sons Chemists and Druggists since 1879. Inside, the shop was cramped but immaculate. Glass jars lined the shelves in neat rows, their contents labeled in looping script, quinine, digitalis, laudanum. The bell above the door gave a polite chime as Drake entered. A bespectacled clerk looked up from behind the counter. Help you, sir. Drake set the torn scrap of label on the polished wood. Looking for something that ends with tine. Recognize the style. The clerk adjusted his glasses, studying the scrap. Yes, could be from a bottle of strophantine. Heart medicine. Potent stuff. Very small dosage required any more, and it's dangerous. Dangerous how? Stops the heart without much warning. The dose between cure and the other thing is razor thin. Drake's mind ticked through what he'd seen in the study. No glass. No food. Could have been in anything, even an envelope flap. Sell much of it? Drake asked. The clerk shook his head. Only by prescription. Mostly to older gentlemen with certain cardiac complaints. Any sales in the past week? The man hesitated, then fetched a ledger from under the counter. He flipped through, running a finger down the columns. 2, he said finally. 1 to a Dr. Elwood for a patient in St. Bridget's Home, and 1 to a Mr. Adrian Price. Drake kept his tone level. When? 3 days ago. He said it was for his uncle, but I remember thinking it odd he didn't want it delivered. Describe him. Tall, well-dressed, dark hair. spoke like he was used to giving orders. Drake's lips tightened. It was Price to the last syllable. The bell above the door chimed again. Another customer stepped in, but froze when he saw Drake, a stocky man in a dockworker's coat, hat pulled low. His eyes darted to the scrap of label still on the counter, then back to Drake. Without a word, he turned and stepped quickly back into the rain. The clerk frowned. "You know him?" "No," Drake said, pocketing the scrap. "But I have a feeling I will soon." Drake stepped back onto Millwright Street just as the dockworker disappeared around a corner. The tram rumbled past, masking Drake's first few footsteps as he followed. The man had the gait of someone used to carrying heavy loads, broad shoulders hunched forward, arms swinging in short arcs. He didn't look back, but his pace quickened once they reached the riverfront road. They ended up in the dock sprawl, where warehouses leaned toward the water and the smell of brine and coal dust never lifted. The dockworker pushed through the warped door of the Brass Gull, a low-ceilinged pub lit by gas mantles and the occasional flare of a match. Drake slipped in after him, keeping to the shadows along the bar. The man took a seat at a rear table, where a thin figure in a long overcoat was already waiting. The dockworker pulled an envelope from inside his coat. No words, no handshake, just the slide of paper across rough wood. The thin man cracked the seal enough to glance inside, then nodded once. He reached into his own coat and handed over a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Drake couldn't see the contents, but the size was right for a bottle. The dockworker made to leave, but the thin man caught his wrist. He leaned in close, speaking just loud enough for Drake to catch fragments. "Tonight, before they find it. Price doesn't wait." Drake angled toward the door, slipping out before either man could spot him. The night had deepened, the mist from the river curling through the alleyways. He took up position across from the pub, waiting. 5 minutes later, the dockworker emerged, parcel under his arm. He turned east away from the warehouses, toward the terraced lanes of Ashford core. Drake followed. They wound up at a narrow brick rowhouse with a chipped blue door. The dockworker unlocked it quickly and stepped inside. No lights came on. Drake waited until the quiet stretched too long, then crossed the street. He tested the handle locked. A faint clink of glass came from inside, followed by the scrape of a drawer. By the time Drake circled to the back, the rear door was ajar. The kitchen smelled faintly sweet, and on the table, unwrapped, sat a bottle with a torn label ending in "Tyne." The kitchen was small, the air heavy with damp plaster and the faint metallic tang of something recently boiled. Drake stepped over a loose board, eyes scanning the shadows. The bottle sat in the middle of the table like an accusation glass clear, label fragment matching the scrap he'd found, a residue clinging to the lip. Beside it lay a small black ledger, the kind dock foreman used to track incoming cargo. Drake flipped it open. The entries were terse, written in a rough but steady hand. 4/12, Baker, 3 crates. 4/15, Gull, 1 bottle. 4/16, P, envelope. The page after that was torn out cleanly. The letters P and Gull were enough to stir the edges of recognition. The Brass Gull, Price's chemist purchase, and now a delivery pattern. A floorboard creaked above. Drake froze. The sound was too heavy for a rat, too deliberate. He slid the bottle into his coat pocket, the ledger into the other. The creak came again, this time closer to the stairs. There was no point in subtlety now. Drake moved to the back door and stepped into the alley, boots quiet on the wet cobblestone. From the shadowed end of the lane, a man's voice called, "You shouldn't be here, detective." The dockworker stood half-lit by a street lamp, his right hand in his coat pocket. His jaw was set, eyes watchful. "You knew Price?" Drake asked. The man spat to the side. Knew him enough. He pays, I carry. Don't care what's in the box. You cared enough to take a bottle of Heartstopper to a locked room corpse. The dockworker's eyes flickered surprise or guilt. Drake couldn't tell. You don't know what you're talking about. Before Drake could close the distance, a whistle cut the night sharp, urgent. The dockworker's head snapped toward the riverfront, and in that heartbeat, he bolted. By the time Drake reached the street, the man had melted into the fog rolling up from the water. Drake stood there, the weight of the bottle and ledger pulling at his coat, knowing two things with certainty. 1. Price's neat solicitor mask was cracking. 2. The dockworker was scared not of Drake, but of someone who could make men vanish in Ashford without leaving ripples. Clara Lestock opened her door with the air of someone who hadn't slept since Drake's last visit. Her dressing gown was belted tight, hair hastily pinned, eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "You found something," she said, before Drake even stepped inside. He set the small black ledger on her writing desk. "Recognize the handwriting?" She frowned, flipping through the entries. "Yes, my uncle's." The room seemed to tighten around her admission. "He kept records of meetings at the Brass Gull," Drake said. "Deliveries from someone named Baker. A payment from P. Any idea what that means?" Clara's jaw worked before she answered. "Baker's a chemist. Uncle used to help him with shipments from the docks. He said they were medical supplies, but I knew there was more. He was always talking about easy money, just one more deal before he could retire." "And P?" Her eyes dropped. "Price." Drake leaned back slightly. "Your uncle was working with Price on whatever this was. He dies. Price buys a bottle of Strophantine. A dockworker moves it. Now I find your uncle's ledger in that same man's house." Clara met his gaze, unflinching. "You think Price killed him?" "I think Price had a reason to silence him. Maybe your uncle knew too much. Maybe he threatened to walk away." She shook her head slowly. "If Price did it, he didn't act alone. Uncle had other associates, people who don't forgive betrayal." Drake noticed her hand tightening on the ledger. "Clara," he said, "if you're holding anything back, now's the time." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "There's a name missing from that book. The man who brought Price and my uncle together. He calls himself Marlowe." Drake had heard the name, a ghost in Ashford's underworld, never photographed, never arrested. "Where can I find him?" Drake asked. "You don't," Clara said flatly. "He finds you. And if you're smart, you'll hope he doesn't." Drake left with the ledger under his arm, the rain starting again, soft at first. But he had the feeling it wouldn't stay soft for long, not with Marlowe in the mix. The rain slicked the tramlines into silver ribbons as Drake cut through Ashford core. He'd meant to head back to his flat, dry out, and put the ledger under lock. But halfway down Bryan Street, a voice came out of the fog. "Detective Vane. We should talk." Drake slowed, scanning the shadows. A man stepped forward, coat collar turned high, brimmed hat angled low. His face was unremarkable, which was remarkable in itself. No scars, no distinguishing marks, nothing for the mind to hold on to. "Marlowe," Drake said. The man smiled faintly. "I see Clara still talks too much." They walked, not by agreement but by the gravity of Marlowe's pace. He led Drake into a side street, where the rain was cut off by an iron awning. "I know why you're asking about Lestock," Marlowe said. "And you should know his death wasn't meant to be loud. It was corrective." Drake kept his tone level. "Corrective for whom?" Marlowe's smile didn't reach his eyes. The sort of people who prefer their profits steady and their associates discreet. "You were Price's handler," Drake said. "I was everybody's handler. Price, Lestock, Baker, even your dock friend. They all worked because I kept them working. And when one decided he wanted out," Marlowe's gaze hardened. "Out wasn't an option. But killing him, that wasn't my order." Drake studied him. "You're telling me you didn't mind losing a man who could sink your operation?" "I'm telling you," Marlowe said, stepping closer, "that if I'd wanted him dead, you wouldn't be chasing ledgers and chemist bottles. You'd be attending a funeral with no body to bury." The rain drummed harder above them. "You're in over your head, Vane," Marlowe continued. "Walk away, and I'll make sure Price settles his affairs somewhere far from Ashford. Keep digging, and you'll be sharing Lestock's grave." Drake didn't answer. He just stepped back into the rain, ledger still under his coat, the weight of Marlowe's warning pressing heavier than the water soaking through his scarf. Drake spent the next 2 days letting whispers travel where they needed to. A word to a tram conductor who drank at the Brass Gull. A passing comment to a beat cop with a cousin in the docks. The kind of slow, deliberate leaks that found their way to Price without ever touching paper. The message was simple. The detective has Lestock's ledger. On the third evening, Drake sat in the tea shop below his flat, pretending to read a penny detective novel. Outside, the tramlines hissed in the drizzle, their sound swallowed by the clatter of cups and the hum of conversation. At precisely 8 o'clock, the door opened and Price stepped in. The solicitor's polished composure was intact, but the eyes gave him away, searching, calculating, a flicker of something that might have been fear. "Detective Vane," Price said, sliding into the opposite seat without invitation. "You've been busy." "Just following the paper trail," Drake replied, setting his book aside. "Funny thing about ledgers, they tell stories numbers never mean to tell." Price's mouth tightened. If that ledger were to disappear, perhaps we could come to an understanding. Drake leaned in slightly. "An understanding like you had with Lestock? You paid him to move something dangerous, didn't you? Then you decided he was more risk than asset." Price didn't flinch, but his hand curled on the table, the knuckles whitening. "Careful, detective. Accusations without proof are slander." "I've got proof," Drake said evenly. "Ledger, bottle, witness. Enough to make the department ask why a solicitor's ordering Heartstopper from a chemist at the docks." Price's composure cracked, just for a second, a thin line opening in the mask. "You don't understand. This wasn't mine. I was paying off a debt. Someone far above my station required the arrangement." Drake's mind supplied the missing name, Marlowe. "You're saying Marlowe told you to kill him?" Drake asked. Price's eyes darted toward the window, as if the name itself might summon the man. "I'm saying nothing of the sort. I'm saying I'm not the one you want." "That's where you're wrong," Drake said, rising from his seat. "Because you had the opportunity, Price. And with the right nudge, you had the motive." Drake left him there, stiff in the lamplight, knowing Price was cornered. The next move would be his, and desperation makes even careful men clumsy. It started with the smell. Ashford's underworks always carried the damp scent of rust and old water, but tonight Drake caught something sharper: burning oil. He was halfway down the narrow stair to the tram maintenance tunnels when he saw it. Smoke curling from the old boiler room, the one with a single rusted door. Inside was where he'd hidden the ledger after Price's visit. He drew his revolver and pushed through. Flames danced across the far wall, licking up the timbers, heat baking the air. In the middle of the room, Price, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled, was shoving the oilskin-wrapped ledger into the blaze. "Too late, detective," Price said, voice shaking but determined. "This ends here." Drake moved fast. He didn't aim for Price, he aimed for the chain hoist above, a single shot snapping it loose. The hook dropped, striking the burning grate, scattering the ledger back onto the floor before it could be fully consumed. Price lunged for it, but Drake's shoulder caught him mid-stride, sending them both crashing into the soot-black wall. The impact drove the wind out of the solicitor, but not his desperation. "You don't understand," Price spat, struggling. "If Marlowe knows I failed." "He already knows," Drake cut in. The words froze Price just long enough for Drake to wrench him toward the door. But before they could reach it, shadows filled the threshold. 3 men. No insignia, no hesitation. Marlowe's. One stepped forward. "The book stays. So does he." Drake's mind raced. The smoke was thickening, the flames chewing their way up the walls. They were trapped between fire and men who didn't bluff. He fired once, not at them, but at the gas lamp on the far side of the room. Glass shattered, light died, and in the chaos of the dark and the smoke, Drake dragged Price sideways through the maintenance hatch barely 3 feet high. They tumbled into the tunnel beyond, coughing, the ledger pressed hard against Drake's chest. Behind them, boot steps pounded, then stopped. Marlowe's men weren't eager to follow into the narrow, crumbling passage. By the time Drake pulled Price up into the street, the solicitor's polished mask was gone. He was just a man breathing hard, eyes wild. "You don't know what you've done," Price rasped. "Sure I do," Drake said. "I just made you the safest man in Ashford for the next 12 hours. The rain came back hard, drumming against the tramlines like a war march. Drake stood in the middle of the Brass Gull, the old dockside pub where deals were made in whispers and promises died in pints. Price sat at a corner table, collar up, a cheap raincoat replacing his usual silk. He looked like a man watching the door for someone who wouldn't come, but Drake knew better. Marlowe would come. It had taken 3 hours to set the bait. Word in the underworks. Price had the ledger again, and he was ready to sell it to the highest bidder before skipping town. The right ears carried that up the chain to Marlowe, who couldn't afford for those numbers to see daylight. So Drake waited, revolver under his coat, boots wet from the walk. The door opened. Marlowe entered like a man who owned the rain. No hesitation, no scanning the room, he already knew where Price sat. 2 of his men flanked him, their coats hanging heavy, hands inside. "Mr. Price," Marlowe said softly as he reached the table. "You've been busy." Price's hands trembled on his glass. "I was trying to clean it up." "Get out." Marlowe smiled, but there was no humor. "Out? There is no out. You carried my debt, you carried my secrets, and then you got sloppy." He turned slightly, and that's when Drake stepped forward from the bar. "You're right, Marlowe," Drake said, voice carrying over the low hum of the pub. "There is no out. Not for him. Not for you." Marlowe's gaze locked on him. "Detective, I'd hoped you'd taken my advice." "I did," Drake said. "You told me to walk away. So I walked straight into the room where both of you could hear what the other had to say about Lestock's death." He tossed the ledger onto the table. Price flinched. Marlowe didn't move. "Ledger's missing a page," Drake went on. "Funny thing, though, that page is in my desk at the precinct, under a signed statement from Price here about how you ordered the hit. Opportunities his. Motives yours. Together, it's enough to hang you both." Marlowe's men shifted. Drake raised his revolver, steady. "Walk away," Drake said, echoing Marlowe's earlier words, "and I'll let the law take it from here. Make a move, and you won't live to see trial." For the first time, Marlowe hesitated. Then he smiled faintly, sat down across from Price, and said, "You'll never hold me, detective." "Maybe not forever," Drake replied, "but long enough." The uniforms came in then, sealing the exits. By the time they led both men out into the rain, the city felt quieter, as if Ashford itself had been holding its breath and finally let it go. Drake stood under the eaves, watching the tramlines shine. Another case closed. Another debt to the city paid, though he knew the ledger of Ashford's sins was far from balanced. And somewhere out there, in the dark between the tram bells, the next name was already being written.
The rain keeps falling, but Ashford's secrets never wash away. You've been listening to A Room Above the Tramlines on Audible Archives. If the shadows gripped you, like, comment, and subscribe, because the next case is already waiting.
Another chapter closes, but the archives remain, waiting for the next seeker of stories. Here, no voice is lost, no tale truly ends. This is Audible Archives. Until we meet again, may your mind wander freely and your heart never forget the stories we share.